Now we are going to dig in deeper on an issue that is central to this economic conversation, which is one that was also, of course, a big part of the campaigns this year, but has long been one of the most popular topics at our New Deal conferences, and that is, of course, housing affordability. The panel will be led by longtime New Deal leader, former mayor of Burlington, Vermont, Miro Weinberger. He is now the visiting fellow at the Taubman Center for State and Local Government at Harvard's Kennedy School. Joining him are Salt Lake City Mayor Erin Mendenhall, Laura Arce, Senior Vice President of Economic Initiatives at Unidos US, which is the nation's largest Hispanic civil rights advocacy organization. And we have Sarah Bronin, who leads the National Zoning Atlas, which is digitizing, demystifying, and democratizing information about zoning in the United States. So join me in welcoming Miro and the rest of the panel. Yeah, sure.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be here with you and be able to be part of this panel. I'm going to kick things off with just some sort of overarching remarks, and then we've got this awesome panel that's going to take on different aspects of this housing challenge. I wanted to echo where the last panel finished and thank Jonathan, Helen, Debbie, really the entire New Deal team for putting on another great annual conference. I think this is the 13th annual conference I've come to, and it has just been awesome to see these events getting bigger and better through the years. And I am particularly heartened to see the focus that housing has been this year, really a major theme of the past 2 days. In addition to this panel, yesterday there was a great permitting reform breakout group. If you didn't get a chance to see it, you can check out the materials from it. There's some great ideas there. And, but also when we heard from Secretary Pete that our work should be all about everyday issues, there is no issue that defines everyday life and affordability more than the cost and the quality of your home. When Jennifer Palka at the end of the day raised the alarm and says we can't be the party of government if government doesn't work, she's talking about housing too, as there really is no area where government is failing more right now than with housing. How bad is that failure? Here are a few of the metrics that jump out to me. Some projections say we are 7 million homes as a country short of where we need to be, and that has driven homeownership just out of reach for big swaths of the country in ways that they're angry about, and it has caused an unprecedented number of Americans to have to spend more than half of their income on rent. It's even worse for the 650,000 Americans now that are homeless, a record number. But it's not just that, right? Like the housing shortfall impacts so many of our other social and economic challenges as well. One example from my home state of Vermont, we've had rising healthcare costs, soaring healthcare costs for many years now. It's gotten so bad that we're having an active conversation about near-term dramatic service cuts across the state. The state put out a big report this past summer saying, how do we fix the healthcare crisis? Their number one transformational recommendation, build a lot more homes, because right now nurses and other critical healthcare workers just simply don't have a place to live. A last indication, one I think that has been very much on our minds through these 2 days of our failure to build enough homes is in the election results themselves. The biggest red shifts, heard this on Ezra Klein this morning, I hadn't quite known this before. The biggest red shifts took place in blue cities and in blue cities in blue states, which generally speaking are also the areas where our housing costs and housing pressures are highest. Klein and Matt Iglesias, who we heard from yesterday, and other journalism has made it pretty clear that Democratic policies on housing, unintentionally, but much more so than in Republican policies, have made our cities and states that our party runs shockingly unaffordable because of a complex web of state and local laws and ordinances that have made it way too hard to build homes, which is fundamentally the problem. That is what is driving this crisis. We've made it too hard to build. To her great credit, Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, understood this and spoke far more about creating housing than any presidential candidate ever has. But fixing this problem, building a lot more homes of all types for all income levels, is not something that can be solved by presidential speeches alone. This is a problem that has grown law by law, ordinance by ordinance for decades, and it is going to take years of sustained policy and implementation work to turn it around. New Deal leaders, in many cases, are, as you're going to hear, and should be leading this work. The pro-growth, progressive values that this organization has stood for since the very start are exactly what's needed to fix this problem and restore the Democratic brand with respect to housing. We need to fix the housing market that our policies have broken, and we need to grow and build our way out of this housing shortage. I'm just going to take a couple minutes more to describe what I see as the guiding principles of that work, and then we'll get into other ways to approach it with my colleagues here. As Jonathan noted, I spent 15 years as a housing developer before becoming mayor, and I learned the hard way during that time just how hard it was to build, including, one big example that always stuck out with me. We had one project that a single neighbor essentially single-handedly held up for a decade that kept us from bringing onto the market 25 much-needed homes. When I became mayor, I knew we had to fix this, and that was one of my top priorities throughout the 12 years that I was in office, and we did have significant successes. The numbers are going to sound small compared to what Erin and I think others have done, but Burlington's a small place. We're only 45,000 people. We got more than 2,000 homes either completed or constructed during my time in office, which was about a 400% increase in housing production over prior decades. Thank you. The principles of that work, I think there's really four principles to me that kind of have broader application. One is we have to end that veto-ocracy that allowed that one neighbor to block a project for a decade. It exists in many other areas, and we're never going to get where we need to be if we can have one abutter stop a project for that length of time. This is going to be difficult for us to do as a party because we have long advocated for more public engagement and more public process, but we have to be smarter about how we do this. Big theme of the permit reform group yesterday is that the public engagement needs to come when discretionary decisions are being made about housing policy, when that policy is being set, not on a project-by-project basis, as so often is how it works now. We need to reduce housing costs wherever we can. Low-hanging fruit like eliminating wasteful parking requirements, which Burlington and now hundreds of other cities have done, is one way to get right at that. Getting rid of redundant permitting requirements. We actually, in Vermont, we have a state and a local land use law. It's got to end. But it's also going to take the difficult, sustained kind of tending of our garden, of our land use policies, if you will, like Jennifer Palka argued yesterday. I'd urge everyone in the room, no matter what your role, to lean into the housing abundance movement in one way or another. It's really one of the most positive things happening in the country right now, I believe. We got done in my final city council meeting just last spring. We passed a neighborhood code that essentially legalizes 2 structures on every lot in Burlington, and each structure can have up to 4 units. There is no way that we would have gotten such a pro-housing policy done were it not for this grassroots Vermonters for people-oriented places that sprung up in my last few years in office. 20 and 30-something young folks coming out and making it very clear that when opponents were arguing about nuisance issues like shadows and maybe a little more traffic, the trade-off to that was them being able to find a home and grow a life in Burlington. This is a movement that is growing. There are now, I think, 7 states that have statewide professionalized housing abundance movements. One of the things I'm trying to do right now is create a new group in Vermont that advocates for pro-housing policies at the state and the local level. Still, there's not nearly enough people doing this nationwide. There's only about 80 folks who sort of get paid to lobby on pro-housing work day to day. You compare that to like climate politics where there's probably more than 5,000 folks. This is an area we need all sorts of energy and investment. And then finally, I think that to some degree, mayors and state officials have to think of themselves and really become developers in a way. You know, what do I mean about that? I mean, I know that's antithetical to a lot of folks. Whenever we see a villain in a movie about a city, the villain is usually either a developer or a mayor. I've been both. That actually is a function of how bad our policies are, that bribery and corruption is how a lot gets built. When I look back on the 2,000 homes that we created in Burlington, a bunch of them came from the land use reforms I've sort of touched on here, but more than half of them came from the city being an active partner in a major project. The city building millions of dollars of infrastructure using tax increment financing or other tools, the city swapping land. It was hard work. It took, we had to negotiate long agreements and renegotiate them and over. We had to build that capacity in a city that really had lost it. I think a lot of cities have done that. It's time. Many places need to get back to their roots of cities being growth machines if this is going to work. All right. So with that, those are my thoughts. I'm excited to hear from our other panelists now. Erin, you want to kick us off and describe the remarkable successes you've had in Salt Lake?
I think you've had remarkable success with over 400%. That's fantastic.
Well, thank you. But it's not doubling the number of homes in the downtown like you've done, as I understand it.
Salt Lake City is in an amazing spot right now. I'm Erin. If I haven't met you yet, I want to. It's my first New Deal in DC. And I am really a nerd about cities. I love being a mayor. It was never in my plan. And the cool part is you get to do things that impact your backyard and your kids' teachers' backyards and front yards. And I love this work. I was born in a double-wide trailer in Arizona, and parents were immigrants, refugee immigrants, and my dad's family goes way back. So the experience of being in this role right now and getting to build housing is just an American dream in and of itself. In Salt Lake City, we're in the fastest growing state in the nation. Utah has led population growth since 2010. We've had about 24% population growth. Our downtown core grew through the pandemic. Doesn't mean we didn't lose some businesses, but our downtown population since 2020 will have doubled by first quarter next year. And we're looking at about 10,000 more units coming online in the years following that. So we added a NHL team. They just started in October. We just got the Olympics re-awarded to us in July. They'll be coming back in 2034, the Winter Olympics and Paralympics. And so we're in a great horizon for investment, and there's a lot of investment happening. That's part of the lens through which I get to say that the city has increased our rate of investment just about over 400% also. We put a portion of our sales tax, and we collect 10% of all of our tax increment deals across the city. The first 10% goes into affordable housing creation. So since 2020, we've invested about $120 million in the creation of, and in some cases, the preservation of affordable housing in our city. And that's totaled almost 6,500 units since 2020. But of course, it's the really deeply affordable housing, 30% AMI and lower, that is the most difficult to produce. We also, as a growing city, have an on-street homeless population because we don't have enough shelter beds open. We didn't build the permanent supportive and transitional housing that the Homeless Shelter Services Plan called for, the we being the entire state of Utah. And this is a problem that affects our Salt Lakers at an increasing rate. So more than half of Salt Lakers are now renters. That's the highest that we've ever had in our history. And of those renters, over half of them are cost burdened. So they're paying more than 30% of their income for their household costs. In addition to that, like a lot of capital cities and larger cities, we're a medium-sized city at 200,000. Families have been moving out for decades. And I believe really firmly that if you, as a mayor, for those of you who are mayors, are not incredibly focused from zoning, economic development, and the tools that you have to create housing, that families are going to be pushed out by the market naturally. The market is not being built for families, and downtowns are not being built for families. But when I go to a rad downtown, it's one that has kids walking to school through the central business district. It's a place where families are hanging out after 5 o'clock because they live there and they're at the park together. That's the kind of a future downtown that I feel like we need to focus on and make happen. So part of our focus has been in putting greater incentives toward family-sized units and trying to remove some of the barriers that exist in our zoning and our economic development strategies that haven't let childcare facilities exist in the downtown as much.
Yeah, I hope we get to come back to that and the questions and that. I think that's really unusual from what I've heard about where a lot of the housing market is going, those larger units. So hearing how you did that in Salt Lake in more detail would be great. But first, let's go to Sarah Bronin. Welcome, Sarah. Excited to hear about your zoning atlas work and more.
Sure. So hi, everybody. I'm Sarah. I am the wife of a mayor here, Luke Bronin. So I dedicate all of my remarks to him. Just kidding. Or yes, I do, actually. And I was really lucky for 7 years to serve as chair of the City of Hartford's Planning and Zoning Commission, appointed by his predecessor, and really dig into the city's zoning code. I'm a law professor at Cornell, and I do lead this project called the National Zoning Atlas. And I wanted to pick up on one of the things that our mayor from Salt Lake City just said, and to say that zoning is a really important factor in housing. And it's not just, I think you've underscored this point in your remarks, it's not just whether the housing can be built, but it's also all of the other things that are happening in and around the area where housing is. So whether it's a central business district, whether it's shops that people can walk to, creating whole communities, whole neighborhoods through zoning is really important. So I've dedicated I guess right now, my career to helping people understand what zoning is and how it works in their lives, both with regard to housing, but also with regard to everything else. So right now I'm doing that in two ways. First is actually a book that just came out a few weeks ago, and it is called Key to the City, How Zoning Shapes Our World. And actually, our moderator is in the book. So I wanted to present you with a copy of it. And he's actually in the book for something other than housing creation. Burlington has pioneered some innovative ideas about streets as well as parking. And so the provisions that I call out in the Burlington approach really actually do relate to that whole community approach. But the second way that I've really tried to illustrate how zoning works in our world is through this project called the National Zoning Atlas. So how many people here have read cover to cover your zoning code? Okay, I see like 3. So we have read cover to cover the zoning codes of over 5,000 communities across the country, 550,000 pages of zoning codes, and we have put information up to an interactive online map at zoningatlas.org/atlas is where you get right to the map. And we have 8 states that are up on the map already, before I forget. Connecticut, the first state that we put up, Hawaii, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Arizona, Nevada, and Massachusetts. We do have Shelby County up on the map, Mayor Harris. We have all of Salt Lake County up on the map. We're finishing Colorado, California, New Mexico, and we've made significant headway in Montana, 800 communities in Texas, 300 in North Carolina and Ohio each. I'm just rattling off that list because I know we have huge diversity here in terms of representation, and that many of you work at the local levels. What our map does is it basically allows apples to apples comparisons. So incidentally, we do have Burlington up on the map and we have Salt Lake City up on the map. Given what Mayor Mendenhall just discussed, you would not be surprised to know that Salt Lake City allows 97% of land in the city, it allows housing to be built as of right. The only other city that I know comes close is Hartford, where we eliminated all public hearings, something that Miro talked about in his remarks, being, I think, one of the biggest barriers to housing production. In taking that approach, in eliminating public hearings and allowing housing to move forward as of right, you've unlocked a huge amount of housing, and Hartford is on its way to doing the same, we hope. So just to kind of add a few more things that we cover in the map and that I cover in the book in a more storytelling kind of way. Minimum parking requirements, what I have called in my research zoning by 1,000 cuts. All of these really technical terms, setbacks, height caps, minimum parking requirements, lot coverage requirements, minimum unit sizes. I know we have a state senator from Connecticut in the room. People were surprised to learn that one of our wealthiest towns in Connecticut required 3 parking spaces for a studio apartment and required every apartment that would be built in that community to be 2,000 square feet. Okay, so 2,000 square foot studio apartment with 3 parking spaces. Those are the kinds of provisions that we are finding in zoning code after zoning code around the country that prohibit housing. And by the way, it's not just what's happening in Memphis, it's not just what's happening in New Orleans, it's not just what's happening in Salt Lake City, but it's also what's happening in the surrounding metros. So we're also finding huge discrepancies between the housing permitted in the central cities and the housing permitted in the suburbs, and minimum lot sizes that cause environmental degradation, sprawl, stormwater runoff, and more. So I encourage you to look at the resource. It's free. You can click on your jurisdiction and it'll calculate the amount of housing, the amount of land that can be devoted to housing in the jurisdiction. And in about a week, we will have downloadable snapshots for every jurisdiction we have up. So I think that's all I needed to say, right?
That was awesome. That was great. I'm excited to dig into the atlas more and the book. Laura, welcome. We're very excited that Unidos US is here and participating, and excited about your housing and homeownership initiative.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, I'm also very excited to take a look at the atlas. It sounds like a really great project and will help a lot of us who are working at the local level. So good morning. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here representing Unidos US. My name is Laura Arce, and I'm our Senior Vice President for Economic Initiatives. And I lead something we call the Home Ownership Means Equity Initiative, the HOME Initiative. And the focus of this initiative is to narrow and ultimately close the Latino homeownership gap. And we have an interim goal of helping to create 4 million new Latino homeowners nationwide this decade. And I would maybe step a little bit back in case, maybe not everyone is familiar with my organization. Unidos US is the country's oldest Latino civil rights organization. We're headquartered here in Washington, D.C., and we also have offices in California, Arizona, Texas, and Florida. So in general, we work at the federal level and nationwide, but we do have some state level, local level work in those states. We're a civil rights organization, so I would say that's kind of the North Star of the work that we do, but we are a cross-issue organization. So I have colleagues who focus on workforce, health, education, and of course the housing space is where I focus my time. Our organization, we've long have worked on housing matters, whether on the program side or the public policy side. And I would say that in particular, we have focused within housing, because housing is a big thing. We tend to focus mostly on the homeownership side. And that's for several reasons. I mean, housing is important across the spectrum, but for homeownership, we focus on it for a few reasons. I think historically, a lot of what we would talk about is about the representation of homeownership being that gateway to the middle class, to building generational wealth, and it's something that is often cited as a big priority when we do polling and surveys of the Latino community. But I think, the more, especially in recent years, the more housing has been elevated in the broader public policy discussion. We recognize things like, now we understand that your zip code is a better predictor of your health outcomes than your DNA code. We also know that your zip code is the best predictor we have in the US of your social mobility and what opportunities you have. So clearly where you live really matters. And within that, home ownership, that added representation of family and security and stability is really key and important. And so that's why we focus on that space. And maybe, one kind of last theme I'll touch on before, for kind of in my introduction is, historically, Unidos, the work we've done around advancing homeownership has been focused on things like policy and advocacy around, fighting lending discrimination and fair housing programs, as well as on the more programmatic side of helping first-time home buyers through education and counseling and education. And all those things remain very important, and they're certainly continue to be part of the work that we do. But in the last few years, it's become clearer and clearer that housing supply and availability and affordability are really our top barriers. And so right now, if someone were to ask me, what is the #1 barrier to closing the Latino homeownership gap? I would say housing supply. We are not building housing, enough houses, particularly across different income spectrums for different sizes and types of families, different types of workers. And so, sometimes when I go to certain housing conferences, people sometimes scratch their heads why is Unidos here? And it's, in short, I think housing supply is a civil rights issue. And that's why we focus on it. So, I'm looking forward to the conversation. You can dive into a lot more, but a little bit about who we are and why we care about this work.
That's great, Laura. That's great to hear that a civil rights organization identifies supply in that way, and I think it represents really the mindset shift that we're talking about here. That's really going to be needed. I don't think there were many spaces a few years ago where kind of progressive folks were sitting around talking about how to achieve progressive goals through expanding housing supply, but that there's suddenly been this broad realization of it is really encouraging. So we want to get to questions from all of you in a moment. I guess I can't help but one follow-up. Erin, can you say a little bit more about how you have used the zoning ordinance to encourage 3 and 4 bedroom units? It's definitely a challenge I always found is builders, even if we had somehow encouraged that through the zoning ordinance, I always sort of got pushback even from affordable housing builders about building that type of unit for various sort of financing reasons. So tell us more how you've done that.
Money.
Yeah.
Yeah. The zoning, we have form-based code adoption in a lot of parts of our city. So we do not do it through zoning at all.
Okay.
We're going to give you more money as a developer. We're going to give you a lower interest rate on a loan that we give you. Typically, it's less than 10% of their total capital stack, but it's significant. And so it's through the financing that we're able to incentivize the creation of those family-sized units more. But if there are zoning ways, I think I'm sure Sarah could tell us how we could do it and maybe double our efforts through better zoning on it. But money's the big deal.
All right, that's great. Let's go to the questions. Welcome.
Hi, Amir Faroki, Atlanta City Council. I represent the densest part of the state, so I have a community that's very comfortable with density, but I have lots of scars from zoning battles. I don't view this as a partisan issue, but to the extent it is, I think there's zoning issues and school redistricting issues are the 2 categories where I think liberals and progressive lose their liberal values. And I'm curious, so much of our orientation on these conversations have been, how do we make progress as center-left Democrats vis-a-vis oftentimes Republican opposition or framing. But on this issue, I think oftentimes the challenge is not Republicans, it's really kind of affluent, oftentimes liberals who live in center cities who are uncomfortable with more density or expanded density. And I'm curious how, maybe Mayor Mendenhall, but all of you have insight into this, kind of where there's opportunity to make progress with getting folks to think about the issue through the new neighbors, right? Or not pulling up the drawbridge behind you. Okay, you've benefited from being here. So that making these policy changes is, it's always going to be pitched, but that we can make more progress in finding ways to build more housing for folks.
Yeah, thank you. I was on the city council for 6 years, and Miro, we have some things in common. My last council meeting, sort of the gift, I call it a gift that my council gave me was we finally voted on accessory dwelling units. And it had been stuck in the city council for 9 years because the more affluent areas of the city, their representatives were pushing back and saying, just put it basically in the lower income areas in the central city. But the whole approach is about geographic equity in access to housing types and affordability. And just as an aside, I think there's an interesting outcome of opportunity zones, at least that's played out in our city, where it helped to reconcentrate affordability in our neighborhoods of historic poverty, where we've been trying to pull affordability options out of those neighborhoods and distribute them more. The way we got the accessory dwelling units passed, we should have called it mother-in-laws. Think about if we called it the cabana ordinance. Like, you're already convincing a few more people that this is a good thing, but we call it ADUs. So I think the tipping point became the seniors in the district. I represented a wide district that crossed the city longitudinally, and older residents who were on their fixed incomes, retirement, been in my house for 25 years, and the taxes are going up such that I can't afford to live here anymore, and this is not what I want. And that conversation about having access of all ages, people who help build our neighborhoods to be able to stay in our neighborhoods longer, giving my neighbor the opportunity to decide who they want to live in the ADU that they've built with the equity they've earned in their home, who's maybe going to help them shovel a sidewalk and keep an eye on the house with them. So it became an argument about preserving the access to housing for our older population, which was not an approach that the city had taken before. And it really was those kind of East Bench residents who raised their voices, who have easier access to raising their voices, but tipped the scale to get accessory dwelling units across the city. And now we funded a library of accessory dwelling unit plans, because people who own their own house are usually not developers, and this can be really intimidating. So we have a library of approved plans that residents can use that fit in most of our lots.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, and that one of the other things that I did after stepping down from the city's Planning and Zoning Commission was I started a group called Desegregate Connecticut that was essentially a zoning reform group. Obviously, in the name, we were harnessing a social justice movement and a push forward in that direction. And we actually did polling, so we picked our name and then we did polling about statewide zoning reform and different messages that would resonate. And we found that an economic message, an environmental message, and then third, but close, an equity message were part of that. We did videos that showed people, this was right at the beginning of COVID, we did an accessory dwelling unit video with a woman who was a nurse who didn't want to live with her older parents in the same unit. And so, it's kind of trying to tell those stories. But I'm convinced, even though we did pass some statewide zoning reform in Connecticut a year after we were founded, I'm convinced that it's the economic argument that Democrats need to make for zoning reform. So going back to the affordability, I need an accessory dwelling unit so I can stay in my home, but thinking much more regionally about the provision of housing supply, it is an economic argument. You're spending more on social services when you don't have enough housing. People are unable to contribute to the economy. And by the way, in Atlanta, which we are going to start, I think next month, there's 167 metros in the CBSA, I think. So we're heading to Atlanta, our team, very soon. We've collected all the zoning codes. But using Atlanta as an example, I'll predict that what we see is large lot sizes outside of the central city, outside of your district. And that is actually extremely costly for local governments because they have to repave those roads. There's a utility cost. You can get 100 units in a 2-acre minimum lot size subdivision, or you can get 100 units in a single building. And so I think over time we are seeing municipal governments, county governments saying, how are we going to maintain all of this? There's not enough new development to maintain it. I think the fiscal argument for better zoning is going to be the winning argument, and I think Democrats should make that argument.
Can I jump into, I love this question because it's something that I've been thinking a lot about, especially in the last couple of weeks. And I agree with everything you've said. I think about the messaging is so important in knowing your audience and where you are. So all of you know best your local communities, the state you work in terms of which of these messages is going to work. And I think about, like all the reforms that have passed in the last number of years in California, and then a lot of very similar policies around ADUs and all that passing in Montana, and I think about, Montana's, their cry was "Don't California my Montana," but ironically they were passing, some policies that were very much, model on some of the things California had done, and part of that was thinking about, in some places you talk about inclusionary zoning, in other places you talk about property rights, and so just again knowing your audience, and the last, maybe one other, theme or message to kind of put in your arsenal, depending on where you are, that we deployed with our state director in some communities in California is, a lot of this, this local zoning battles, NIMBYs, it's like, us versus them and the newcomers and the outsiders. And so we try to flip it, and it's like, this isn't about, other people coming from who knows where. This is about your kids who went to college and now want to move back home and raise their grandkids near their family, and they can't afford to. So making this about, like, it's not about some other person out there you don't know, but it's about your kids, your grandkids, your extended family being able to live nearby. I know for me, I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area. I grew up in a community where all my grandparents, my cousins, we all lived near each other. We used to see each other every Sunday, and now we're all dispersed, different parts of California and across the country, because it just got too expensive. And we've lost that family center that I think a lot of people are still trying to preserve. And so that's another theme that I think in some places works.
That's great. I'll give you just one last answer quickly on this. Old-fashioned sort of political organizing and coalition building really works as well. Again and again, we had seniors groups and active transportation groups, and we had a group called Vermont Professionals of Color. We had this VPOP group at the end that really was a youth group, AARP, of course, the business community and the affordable housing community and commercial builders. That kind of coalition is very powerful if it's coming out and speaking with a consistent voice. Kind of Oregon has had that, defending the urban growth boundary, pioneering legislation for like 50 years. And it's really, fundamentally, that's why this housing abundance movement, I think, is so important, is it kind of creates a permanent coalition to come out day in, day out, year after year to move this work forward. Okay. Welcome.
Good morning. My name's Shepard Kalantari Johnson, and I'm a Santa Cruz, California City Council member. I really appreciate this conversation. Just for some context, you just mentioned California has passed a number of laws. So local control at the city level has been taken away, I think, for the right reasons. We weren't building. Santa Cruz was among 6% of the state that met our regional housing allocation goals. And we were just given the pro-housing designation. So we're very proud of that. We've been building. We weren't building for too long, and now we're building. My question goes to, how do we keep up with the systems and infrastructures that are needed? And one specific example, you mentioned the laws around parking. So California has also passed state law that does not require parking if you live within a certain distance from a major transit district. So now we get these housing projects that offer zero parking for 200 units, and of course the community's freaking out, and I think for right reason, because our metro bus system, I sit on that board, we're trying, but we're not there. We don't have the transportation system to provide the alternatives to driving your own car. So that's just one example, but I'd love your thoughts on how do we keep up with the other infrastructure needs as we're growing and building. And again, for context, we're a city of about 65,000, so.
Shebra, that's a big question. There's probably a lot of good answers, and I'm going to just offer one idea. We have a housing developer called Give Group, and they may be doing other projects, but the innovative part of some of their projects is a shared car system. So they have they have a couple or maybe a few electric cars that live as part of the tenant access agreement. So you as a tenant can, Salt Lake City is one of the few places in the state of Utah where you can really live without a car if you want to. I don't know that works in Santa Cruz, but through targeting the city's incentives, as limited as and precious as your tax dollars are, to figuring out if you can't yet keep up with the infrastructure impacts that are tremendous and are probably going to be decades of delay. How can you start to incentivize more creative parking solution? We also started funding, sort of a separate issue, but we started funding school bus passes for every public school student in Salt Lake City. Our school district is a separate entity, but they had some money and never enough. So for 3 years now, we've had every public school student with a bus pass, and this year we added one parent per student household. All the educators also. Bus use has skyrocketed. The cool part, like Tashara was saying, it's like double when you can get two things out of it here. We're teaching future transit riders because these kids are not afraid anymore to get on the bus. They know how to use the system, and it helps with our air quality issues. So that was a relatively small investment for the city compared to what it would have cost us to get our transit provider to put more buses into every neighborhood. So maybe some creativity around transportation.
I'll just add that one of the things I try to, the cases I try to make about zoning in my book and in my speaking and work is that zoning is the way that state legislatures have written zoning enabling acts. Local governments have even in California, local governments still have pretty broad powers to use zoning to shape behavior. And I think this shared parking example is a really good one. Things the parking minimums, when instead of those, some cities, including Hartford, have set parking maximums in addition to that, set out bike parking infrastructure, so covered bike parking, showers and changing facilities in workplaces. So I do think that the power of zoning to actually reshape behavior and force the cost of building some different types of infrastructure on property owners and on developers is, I think, under-tapped resource. And I will point out that from the parking side, what we did in having parking requirements where they still exist, and they still unfortunately do exist in basically everywhere except for leading cities, is that we forced developers to subsidize the cost of car infrastructure. So to the tune of billions of dollars, a year maybe even in real estate investment, we tell developers you have to go out and build structured garages, parking spaces. And when you do that, you reduce the amount of land on an individual lot that can be developed for housing. So we already had this infrastructure subsidy that we were forcing on developers. We can maybe have some less onerous subsidies that have benefits to the community that can integrate with the transit system. So, yeah, I agree.
One thing I'd just add is that new developments, new housing does have the potential to create an enormous amount of new public revenues that can be used to handle some of these infrastructure needs. I'm not a huge fan of putting too much of it into parking infrastructure, although sometimes that's necessary. There are all sorts of things. I think it's actually pretty exciting how transportation has changed and all these emerging, essentially, technologies that can help with a car light lifestyle. Like we have a nonprofit car share in Burlington that's quite successful, kind of like a Zipcar for-profit model in other cities. It's become, I think, almost ubiquitous now, but Uber and Lyft go a long way to making a car light lifestyle possible. Okay, so, great. All right. We'll try to be quick in our response. Go ahead.
Hey, Caleb Hemmer is a state house member in Tennessee. So I learned an important lesson last year. I passed an affordable housing bill, and it was mostly bipartisan, but one of my colleagues voted against it, and I went over and asked him why afterward, and he said, when you say affordable housing, my constituents think it means Section 8 housing. And so to try to message better into, attainable housing, workforce housing, et cetera. So I guess and also I would say our state, just really hasn't done anything. They kind of viewed affordable housing as a local issue, not a state issue, and so we're kind of, actually starting to think about it as a state issue. So my question is for folks like me in more conservative states or that haven't done a lot from a state level policy around affordable housing, what are some of those policies that are working we should start looking at, and how should we message around that?
So we work with the Beacon Center in Tennessee, and they've helped us do both the Nashville and Memphis areas in the zoning atlas, which I think they are now hopefully taking to the state legislature and starting to use data to inform those conversations. What we just talked about on Montana, we also saw the Frontier Institute make that property rights argument. They used data from the Montana Zoning Atlas to make it, and then these reforms were dubbed the Montana Miracle. I think looking to Montana would be a really good way to kind of develop a playbook and how to talk about housing options. I usually say housing options, just to, diverse, or maybe not diverse, but a variety of housing options is what I typically say. I'm from Texas. I'm actually from Houston, the only major American city without zoning. And so I'm kind of, I hear that sort of, in the background of my mind. What would somebody in Texas think about this? So I would say look to Montana, look at how they messaged, and see if you can pull from that. But in terms of affordability, I usually just talk about options.
I'll take the approach of defining what affordability looks like. And I think it's probably true that most of us have needed affordable housing at some point in our lives or will need it in the future. And in Utah, supermajority Republican legislature, very conservative, blue dot city. Since 2005, incomes have increased, the median income 19%. Our rent costs have increased 38%, and housing values have increased 83%. So most people in the state of Utah, 70% of Utahns can't afford the median-priced house. And you'd think if it's median, then maybe half of them could, but we can't. So when we talk about our kids who are maybe in college right now, or they're starting to have a family, we want to live by them. And as we did some research, a statewide entity did some research, the value ladder, when you get where we get the closest together on the political spectrum is wanting our families to be near us, at least to have the option to be near us, whether that's your aging parents or your kids when they're starting their own families. Talking about the income spectrum that we experience across a lifetime, and as Utahns we're experiencing intensely in the housing inaccessibility, can help to kind of normalize, but that's a long conversation. Our governor talks about our firefighters and our teachers, and yes, we should, they need more support, but right now they need housing that they can afford.
The state legislature in Utah also laid out a series of options for communities to adopt in zoning. So what they did at the state legislature level was they said, okay, if you want local control, here's a dozen things you can pick from and integrate into your zoning code. That might be another approach that's worth looking at.
Great. I think we have another question over here.
Hi, thank you guys so much for all your talk on this. I think we've probably all worked on stuff like this. I was a city councilor and passed zoning changes in my second to last meeting of my first term, allowing residential floors above our single-story commercial plazas throughout the city. And then on the state level, I've worked on our Housing Champions program, which I got up and running last year, which provides low-interest loans to housing-friendly communities, so you can take different actions, some of which is providing public water and sewer to new areas of town to support zoning. One question that I have is the balance of state and local power always comes up, and how you can kind of supersede or not local powers. And we've tried to redefine this conversation by calling it a partnership, by providing state-level tools like model ordinances, but what do you see working out there? Like, is it places where the states have kind of stepped in and put best practices out there? Is it the Montana approach where we pick from a menu of 5 out of 16 items, or is it California model where there's kind of mandates, or is it like encouraging through these incentives? Because New Hampshire has not much will for the first two options. So I just would welcome some data or anecdotes about what's been most successful.
I'm going to add that maybe it was a follow-up to the last one, that in the state of Utah, they did make the menu available. They required cities to come up with their moderate income housing plan. And in fact, I think that Sarah's research maybe 10 years ago would have shown that across the state of Utah, there were cities that didn't contemplate affordable housing opportunities in any zoning. In other words, it was impossible in some cases to create affordable housing in some parts of the state of Utah. So the state legislature said, not only are you going to come up with a moderate income housing plan, but if you don't, we're not going to give you your road funding. So they gave, I think it was a 3-year window, and cities had to come up with it. Now, whether or not they adopt the plan, there is the next steps of conversion, but tying other funding to it was very compelling from our state legislature.
I'll chime in that you kind of list all like, okay, do we do this or this? Or that? I wanted to say yes, like that's kind of all of it, and part of it too is like how you define success. I mean, it's going to be different depending on where you are in terms of where your expectations are. But I guess the one maybe theme that I've seen kind of like stick is being okay with incremental progress, and that was definitely the story in California. I mean, in the early years, there was a lot of things that were tried that just didn't make its way through, and so they kind of made these the smaller bite-sized pieces, and then like the next legislature built on that, and then built on it. And people got, and next thing you turn around, you're like, oh my God, we can now have 6 ADUs in our backyard in San Diego, that kind of thing. But it wasn't like an all at once. And the other, for those who may not be familiar, there's an organization called Casita Coalition. They're headquartered in California. They work with different states, though. They came out with a playbook, basically taking what worked in California and in Montana and other states, and like here's sort of the different scenarios. So if you Google Casita Coalition playbook, I'm sure you can find it. And it's a pretty good handbook. It's very practical.
The New Hampshire Zoning Atlas Coalition includes several state agencies. It's complete, it's online, and they've been actually looking at a number of things, including mobile and manufactured housing, where those are allowed, lot sizes, and I think their analysis is, just, again, something that can be discussed on with state legislators, and hopefully those conversations are starting to happen to inform where we are in New Hampshire and how incremental change or maybe bigger change can help.
Okay, I think we are out of time. Thank you for all the great questions, and I want to say thank you to this great panel. It's been awesome being able to have this conversation with you.